there's so many elected officials who try to make BDS something it's not. So, while I'm hopeful about all of the mass grassroots support for the BDS movement, I'm also worried about the pressure that a lot of folks are facing when they take on these campaigns, and hoping that we can get to a place where more and more people see it for what it is, that it's a grassroots movement for freedom.
Welcome to the Mondoweiss podcast. I'm your host, Dave Reed. At Mondoweiss, we cover the movements, activists, and policymakers who affect the struggle for freedom in Palestine. On university and college campuses across the United States and Canada, student activists are organizing for Palestinian liberation under the banner of Students for Justice in Palestine, or SJP. As the student-led movement has grown dramatically over the last 20 years, so has anti-Palestinian pushback from Zionist groups and their allies. Organizations like Canary Mission, StopAntisemitism.org, and other similar right-wing groups have focused a lot of their attention on the student activists of SJP. Despite this, the movement on campuses is strong and shows little signs of slowing down. Earlier this year, the National Students for Justice in Palestine organization held its 10th annual conference. In today's episode, Michael Arria speaks with 3 SJP activists about how the movement has grown over the last 10 years and where it is headed in the future.
SJP was started in the early 90s, but it holds its first national conference at Columbia in 2011. Can you talk about the motivation and the impetus behind holding that first initial conference in 2011, please?
So at this point, SJPs were run autonomously. We were just really organizing as individual chapters on our campuses and didn't have a national body or institution that could provide support to us in our unique organizing environments. We had been meeting up with each other at conferences across the country that were put on by various organizations, whether they were Palestine focused or just social justice conferences, and at that point decided that we really needed something that could support students on a national level. So we could, share skills, so we could develop ourselves politically. And so at that point, we decided to host the first conference at Columbia, and that's where it all started. And it was a really great opportunity for us to connect with each other, for us to learn from each other. It was a very exciting time.
I was reading some of the articles about that first conference, including in our own archives at Mondoweiss. And a week before that conference, the ADL put out a report for referring to SJP as one of the top anti-Israel groups in the country, and warned that the organization was growing. There was a counter protest at that first conference, and we've seen obviously a lot of resistance to SJP and groups like SJP since. Can you speak about the kind of resistance that you got over that first conference? And I'm wondering whether it was mainly from pro-Israel groups on campus or coordinated attacks from larger organizations like the ADL.
It was a little bit of both. We did certainly face on-campus pressure and resistance, but truthfully, the worst of it came from off-campus organizations like the ADL, as you mentioned. That list came out. But we also had other, we had blogs written about us. We had national organizations coming after us. And there were also members of the community in New York City, folks who were older, not students, coming out to protest us in person. They were carrying signs that were really terrible, really racist. And it was, awful, but it wasn't anything we hadn't seen before. I mean, if you do organizing for Palestinian freedom, you're used to people attacking you, unfortunately, for your principles. So it wasn't great, but it's something that we've become prepared for and are still committed to what we're doing because we know it's the right thing to do.
We've seen the BDS movement grow in popularity in recent years on campus, especially, but we've also seen a more aggressive anti-BDS movement. Can you speak to some of the challenges that SJP has faced on that level?
To get to that point, 2011, where I was a grad student, and it was just sort of without question, nearly every SJP, wanted to support the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. it was really great to see how much the student movement had embraced this call. At the same time, we have definitely been dealing with a lot of pushback. Students who organize on campus, many of them have had successful divestment campaigns, but now they don't know where to go next, because a lot of times the administration or there's a board of trustees, they won't won't be able to take the next step because of that opposition on campus. Off campus, of course, we see BDS legislation and demonization of BDS at the political level by elected officials. So, there's, of course, a lot of manipulation of what BDS is actually about, right? Like, if we think about movements like defunding the police or divestment from South Africa, it's this very basic principle, right? Like, we pay taxes or we pay tuition dollars, and we should have a say in where that money goes. And we don't want to be supporting human rights violations with our dollars. But of course, there's so many elected officials who try to make BDS something it's not. So, while I'm hopeful about all of the mass grassroots support for the BDS movement, I'm also worried about the pressure that a lot of folks are facing when they take on these campaigns, and hoping that we can get to a place where more and more people see it for what it is, that it's a grassroots movement for freedom.
Thanks again for chatting with me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
I wanted to ask you to start. I mentioned you were an SJP member from 2015 until recently. I'm wondering if you saw any changes in how the group was perceived, or what kind of resistance you faced from the time you joined until more recently when you left. And I was also wondering if anything changed in terms of the resistance you were getting after Trump was elected, since you were there right before you came into office.
First, thanks for talking with me. Great to be able to speak about this. First thing to name is that, repression, surveillance, harassment of Palestine solidarity organizers and their communities is an ongoing issue. And it, wasn't ameliorated with the rise of Trump and the, subsequent sort of liberal hand-wringing at the height of his campaign. So, in that regard, many SJPs had to move in ways that sort of highlighted the, the violence of our so-called democratic institutions on either side of the aisle. It served as an opportunity to build and collaborate with other leftist and progressive issues and movements, seizing the moment by saying, hey, Zionism is violent too, and white supremacy is a boot on the necks of people outside of the imperial core. My local SJP at the University of Georgia, for example, really quickly mobilized alongside other organizations to establish like a formal coalition made up of community and campus organizations, unabashedly embraced anti-Zionism and, more broadly anti-settler colonialism as one of its principles. And so this really forced self-identified liberals to, reckon with the fact that exceptionalization of Palestine is at odds with the principles that they claim to uphold. Sort of in response to our mobilization, my SJP actually ended up losing its funding after being withdrawn from its departmental membership, which it had actually maintained since it was first founded in maybe like 2004, 2005. That was on the local level. And then sort of on the national level, although noting his many shortcomings on Palestine, Bernie Sanders' campaign also sort of represented a significant shift in the national conversation, owing to the work of organizers who pushed him on it, and similarly with the launch of the Movement for Black Lives' platform in 2016, expressing solidarity with the Palestinian people, it, drew the ire of liberal Zionists across the country who, as I mentioned before, were forced to grapple with, some serious cognitive dissonance. So there was a lot of anti-Blackness that spilled out of that situation. We saw the rise of Canary Mission around that time, 2015, 2016, which has, had varied levels of activity since then. So the repression intensified in some ways, definitely, but it was also a period of renewed strength and commitment to the work, I think, for us. So, Trump's pro-Israel policies inflamed the situation. And even National SJP, we were sort of faced with a situation where following the defunding of UNRWA, we had to deal with the fact that people were understandably redirecting their support to other groups and efforts on the ground to sort of fill that newly created gap. It was an opportunity, and it was also sort of a moment of, it was a period of, heightened repression as well.
Can you speak about some of the campaigns that the group was part of at the University of Georgia while you were a member? And then also, I was just wondering maybe some of the success stories that things you were able to accomplish in that time.
Following the sort of like defunding of our chapter, we had to sort of move in ways that would not deplete our resources. Our funding was minimal, but we had to move in ways that would sort of strike a balance between overdoing it, and we needed to sort of continue to maintain our stability and our standing as an organization. We had to be careful to not burn out, because oftentimes you see in SJPs, their membership usually pays from their own pockets. That was the case for us. We didn't quite engage in any particular campaigns, but we certainly sort of did heighten our participation in direct action. One organization, for example, Reservists on Duty, is an organization which brings occupation soldiers to tour across college campuses in the US and I think Canada. And so, we engaged in, some disruption of them. And that was actually following our first disruption. That was when funding was pulled from us. We were hearing things about administration being contacted, and then subsequently, having departments withdraw their sponsorship of an event that we were hosting, for example. But other organizations, other chapters engaged in, there were a lot of divestment campaigns across the country in different regions. On the national level, it's not a campaign, but our annual conference, I think, for National SJP, we had the most widely attended conference in our history in 2018 at UCLA. For many years, NSJP ran the Right to Education Tour, which was developed through a partnership with Berzait University. We brought Palestinian students to college campuses in the US to speak about their experiences under apartheid and occupation. And, that's been a piece of our work for sure. And in part owing to sort of the fact that National SJP was and is a non-hierarchical organization, we don't claim oversight or power over individual Palestine solidarity groups on college campuses, which is something that not many folks know. So, we've historically not been engaged in coordinating campaigns on the local level. Oftentimes that work is up to chapters, and we're there to support them with resources and trainings. So, some might see the work that Zionists do on campuses, bringing camels to their plazas and sending in, violently racist state-sponsored initiatives and orgs like Hasbara Fellowships and Reservists on Duty and Students Supporting Israel, bringing them all year round. And then folks might ask, why aren't we doing that? And so it can feel really, really daunting, but we have done and continue to do so much with so little. And it's, it's really a testament to people power. Capital is not going to save Zionism. National SJP has no headquarters or anything, and virtual and remote work has always been our game. So 2020 was really an opportunity for us to be super intentional about building relationships with movements and groups doing incredible work across the country and around the world. We've hosted panels and webinars, trainings, run different initiatives with Palestinian Youth Movement, Red Nation, Anak Bayan, USCPR, Jewish Voice for Peace. I could go on, So we're definitely growing, and the path towards freedom, is ever closer.
Finally, I wanted to ask you, and you've already alluded to it a little in that response, but if you could speak to how cross-campus activism works within the organization. I know we have the conference obviously every year, but beyond the conference, how are you able to coordinate and build with chapters at other schools? How much interaction is there between chapters? And I'm also wondering if you've been able to establish many connections to organizations beyond the United States as a campus organization based here.
National SJP has always maintained that it is not the overseer of SJPs. They have the autonomy to decide where they go and how they move, and we are there to support. So, in that sense, cross-campus organizing is sort of an ever-evolving sphere within the realm of Palestine student organizing. But especially recently, we recognize that NSJP needs to evolve alongside that, especially considering the power that we have, that sometimes we're not always super keen. Maybe, maybe we just don't recognize it, but we have a lot of power. We don't always name it. Right now, our hope, NSJP's hope, is to become a central hub for students across Turtle Island to engage with things like coordinated campaigns, collective education and trainings, community building initiatives, etc. So we're really trying to strengthen our network right now to build this cohesive strategy. And again, like you mentioned, our conferences have always served as sort of that central space for skill sharing and knowledge exchanges. So, campuses are better equipped to build power and build power together, especially across their unique situations and needs. Right now, regional coordination is especially important for us. And we're steadily working on developing some really innovative ways to communicate with chapters and for chapters to communicate with each other, so that we can sort of build out that infrastructure that we need to achieve our goals. So, to sum up, those coordination methods and strategies have really varied over the years, and have included things like regional conferences. So the Midwest region might host a conference. I think most recently they hosted one in Ann Arbor, and they faced a lot of backlash. Also regional conferences in the South, stuff like that. So, with over 220, I think, Palestine solidarity orgs on college campuses right now, our work is really to develop something more concrete, and that's super vital. To your question sort of about international relationships, in 2020, just this is as an example, the AMED program, AMED program at SFSU launched a series called Teaching Palestine, Pedagogical Praxis and the Indivisibility of Justice. So we had the opportunity to support and engage with a wide variety of organizations such as Al-Qaws, Adamir, Al-Adab Journal, Adala, and Samidoun, and many more. Those relationships, we're building them. We're continuing to we're trying to grow closer, expand our network so that we can maintain those ties and be responsive to organizations and the people on the ground in Palestine. We're continuing, again, to move towards a more cohesive student movement in a lot of different ways, and the future looks really promising.
Raphael, thank you so much for chatting with us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Hi, thanks so much for joining us today.
Of course, thank you for having me.
So I wanted to start by asking about the most recent conference, which just happened last month, It was the 10th anniversary, and obviously you had to do it virtually. I wanted to talk about how that event went, and I'm also just wondering, logistically, did having to do it virtually for this 10th anniversary make anything more difficult than past conferences, or maybe easier?
Yeah, so the conference went really, really well. We had over 70 chapters and hundreds of students registered, and we were really happy with the turnout. Students that registered and came were also just like super engaged with the programming, and many of them even like reached out to us after, us as well as the other organizations that helped us with this conference, and asked us for more information, and just asked us a bunch of questions. And so it's a really challenging time right now for everyone, and folks are experiencing a lot of Zoom fatigue. And so it was really uplifting and just really exciting to see students so engaged, even, at this time. And so, to talk a little bit more about the, I guess, shift to a virtual context. So, as I mentioned, a lot of people are experiencing Zoom fatigue. And so that was definitely a challenge in hosting a virtual conference. But there were also some really, really exciting and, just uplifting parts. So one really exciting thing is that having a virtual conference allowed us to engage chapters transnationally. And so we had students from all over the world register and attend, which, of course, would be much more difficult, if not impossible, in an in-person conference. And then we were also able to connect chapters to grassroots organizations in Palestine. So, for example, we had Al-Qaws come speak at the conference, and that is an opportunity that we would not have gotten otherwise. And so overall, I would say that there were some really big upsides to having the conference virtually.
This conference was titled Safety Through Solidarity, United in Joint Struggle. Can you explain why it was titled that and the significance there?
Yeah, so after the grassroots mobilizing this summer, we as National SJP identified a need to elevate chapters politically through, political education, and then also organizationally through resources and skill sharing, to really intentionally respond to the political moment that we're living in. So we noticed that while there were so many chapters doing really strong community organizing, so there were a lot of chapters engaging in mutual aid and bond relief and supporting people that were just released after being detained for protesting. There were also chapters who were not really engaged or didn't really feel the need to engage for a number of reasons. For example, maybe like viewing themselves as a more cultural as opposed to political organization. But because of this, we needed to create a theme, which, the theme, of course, also really heavily informs our programming, that allows us to build a shared political foundation for chapters to organize around. So, as organizers for Palestine liberation, we know that our safety doesn't come from the police or state institutions. And because we know that Palestine is one component of a larger struggle against imperialism, it was vital that we reaffirmed the idea that we achieve true safety through solidarity, and that the only way to liberation is combating the common enemy through joint struggle.
This was the 10th conference held by Students for Justice in Palestine, but the group has existed since the early 90s, obviously. You're actually undergoing a rebranding, which is detailed on the group's website. Can you kind of explain some of that?
Over the past decade, we've seen National SJP do some really incredible work, right? So we've seen things like the Right to Education tours and these like annual conferences, which brought students together and really helped shape and push forward the student movement. However, the student movement at a local level, was and is currently growing really rapidly. And we realized that National SJP was not, at the time, adequately equipped to meet the student movement's growing needs. So truthfully, we had served as a conference planning body more than anything else. And we knew that in order to support the student movement, we need to really radically restructure and shift our priorities to building out a more fully functioning organization. So following our steering retreat this past March, we decided that we wanted to initiate this process, which, rebranding came out of. So National SJP imagines a student movement that has the political infrastructure to conduct regional, national, and even transnational campaigns. We want to take BDS, for example, beyond the confines of student government votes, and to, the Board of Regents or to university administration itself. So given that we know that that the liberation of Palestine is only realized through the liberation of all people globally, we also imagine a student movement equipped with the knowledge and resources to build coalitions and relationships that are rooted in joint struggle, with the aim of collective liberation, hence our conference theme this year. So to build this movement, we took steps over the past year towards creating a cohesive, centralized structure for the Palestine Solidarity Movement in North America. And as part of this move towards a formalized structure, we initiated 3 projects. The first is developing a national structure for SJP. And then the second, which goes hand in hand with the first, is co-creating shared principles and values for the SJP network. And then in order to move us closer to those goals, we held consultations in the fall of 2020, where we talked one-on-one with over 60 SJP chapters. And the last project that is part of this rebranding is the rebranding of our image. So we wanted our image to be reflective of the organization that we seek to cultivate. And the redesigning of our image, was the first step towards cohering and unifying the student movement. And so in thinking about the elements that create our image, things such as logo, website, color scheme, even our font, we were really intentional, and we tried to choose characteristics that represented the resolve and determination and commitment to Palestinian liberation that we want the student movement to embody.
And finally, you've alluded to this in some of your answers already, but just on a wider level, you're obviously a campus organization based in the United States, comprised of college students in the United States, but you're aligned with the demands of Palestinians. Can you just speak to the wider vision there? How do you bridge that gap consistently and make the necessary connections, to your mind, between the fight going on here over Palestine and the fight going on in Palestine itself for all these decades?
That's a really great question. Thank you so much for asking that. So I have a couple things that I want to say about this, but maybe starting with shifting the framing just a little bit. So, you're absolutely right that SJP is a solidarity-based movement in North America. And in doing it, in being this, our role on campus and in our communities is targeting the ways in which Zionism most concretely materializes. So that is through university investments, police relationships with Israel, anti-BDS laws, the adoption of the IRA definition, all of these manifestations of Zionism that we see. But rather than thinking of it as 2 movements bridging together, the student movement is really one important sector of a much larger movement for Palestinian liberation. So I guess I don't think it's necessarily a question of needing to make the connection between our work, since the connections are really concrete, but rather it's affirming the notion that student organizing is a really powerful vehicle in combating Zionism and in pushing forward the demands for Palestinian liberation. So, going off of that, in terms of concretely bridging specific demands and calls, National SJP is grounded and guided by Palestinian grassroots organizations and works to connect chapters with their actions. So, for example, we led a 3-part virtual political education series with the Palestinian Youth Movement this past summer, which connected student organizers in occupied Turtle Island or North America to student organizers in Palestine. And we discussed things such as abolition and the role of Palestine student organizers in organizing towards abolition, as well as commemorating the Nakba, which the Nakba is the catastrophe which befell the Palestinian people in 1948, in which over 800,000 Palestinian refugees were forcibly displaced from their homes because of Zionist militias. In short, we work with Palestinian organizations really closely to connect demands and align students with Palestinian grassroots organizing. But we also see our work and our movement broadly as intimately connected to the Palestine liberation movement.
Thanks for listening to our show, a production of mondoweiss.net. The music is from Sound of Picture. Visit our site to sign up for free daily and weekly newsletters on Palestine, Israel, and related U.S. politics. If you're enjoying our podcast, please consider becoming a donor by visiting mondoweiss.net/donate. Mondoweiss is a nonprofit publication, and every donation of any amount helps sustain our work. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen, and please leave a rating and review to help other listeners find our show.